So last time I spoke at Fenders, I followed Mandy and all of her fonts. And so I hope you're not disappointed with this amazing font choice, which I don't know the name of or who made it. And it's not variable. So, but it is orange, so I'm pro orange. So comics are said to have passed through 4 distinct ages, and each age of comics is known to have something unique about it. The Golden Age introduced the hero archetype, kicking off around 1938. This is the time when Superman, Wonder Woman, and Batman sort of came to be. During the Silver Age, the world is recovering from a world war, so audiences have matured, so writers need to meet that maturity. Stories focused on horror, crime, and romance become popular and basically help the industries to survive. After the Silver Age used many of the storylines that writers could come up with, the Bronze Age instead tackled social issues of the day in bigotry, racism, substance abuse, and more. And in the modern age, this is a time of redesign and growth in the comic industry. There's also the disruption of the web, so anyone can publish now, bringing their own unique take to comics and stories. So no longer was it about a couple of major players. I think what makes comic books interesting as a storytelling medium is that along with the great characters, artwork, and stories is the impact layout can have on that story. We'll be exploring each age as it relates to the web layout and how CSS Grid and other web technologies are used to recreate these layouts. Now, the following examples are going to be of comics, but as you're having a look at these and I'm explaining to them, have a think about how they can be applied to your projects, because although I'm using comics, these can be applied to anything. So each of the ages I talked about is a span of about 70 years. 70 years is a decent amount of time to evolve a storytelling medium. By comparison, our industry, the web, is relatively young. HTML is 26 years old and CSS is just 22 years old. So embarrassingly, I'm older than both of them, but not together, so that's nice. But if you are, that's not a judgment. Like I said, the web is young and therefore, so are you. But the point that I'm getting to here is that in a relatively short period of time, layout on the web has gone through many ages of its own. We started with HTML, we progressed onto tables. They weren't meant for layout, but you know, you do what you do. The first of our comic crossovers is Flash. So it gave us a lot of creativity, but at the cost of plugins and performance. Absolute positioning and floating layouts has been around for a while. We went through a stage of responsive, or that's sort of where we are now. And then to borrow a term from Jen Simmons, intrinsic design is becoming the more common form that we're using now. So all that in around 26 years, less than half that of our friends in the comic industry. So it can be tempting a lot of the time to give layout on the web a hard time, like it's always been very difficult. But it's amazing how far we've progressed with layout in that short period of time. We can certainly appreciate what we do have now when you know where we have come from. So is the current age going to be considered the web's modern age? I think with Grid, that might be the case. So before we jump into this, I'll introduce myself a little bit more than Jess did. You already know my name. And I work at 7 West Media. So that means Perth Now, The West Australian, and what haven't I said, 7 News. As you know, I'm older than HTML and CSS, but not together. So that gives you an idea of how long I've been working on the web. You can find me on Twitter at ANTONJB. And this is perhaps superfluous information at this point in time, but I've read a lot of comics in my time. So with that in mind, one of the most important comics in history is Action Comics #1. It's released during the golden age of comics. And what makes it important in the history of comics is it's the first introduction of Superman. That's him with the car, not the guy underneath. The layout throughout the comic and other comics of the golden and silver age consisted mostly of squares and rectangles. If we look at a few pages from the comics, you can see that it's fairly consistent there. As I really want to focus on layout, I'm going to strip out the imagery and see what we are left with. The pattern tended to be 1 to 3 panels per row staggered throughout the page with somewhat consistent gaps. They're a little bit messy, but I'm going to assume that's because it was 1938. So in terms of CSS Grid, this is a nice starting point example. You might think it's as simple as setting grid template columns to sort of repeat 3 with 1 fraction. But if we want to achieve the staggered panel effect, we're going to have to think about this a little bit more. So the way that I calculated the number of columns that I needed is to find the smallest gap in the comic. So that was 36 pixels wide. Now the entire width of the comic was 576 pixels. So dividing those two values together, 576 by 36, gave us 16 columns. So that's going to give us enough that we can do staggering and basically recreate all of the layouts. So turning that into grid, we do grid template rows, repeat 16, 1 fraction. If you've used grid before, that will be something you've seen. We don't need grid template rows because we can rely on the intrinsic grid to handle that for us. So the intrinsic grid, what do I mean by that? If content is added to the grid outside of the area that you defined, grid will automatically add new tracks, the area highlighted, to contain that content for us. So by default, they're sized automatically, but you can use grid auto rows to change that value. All right, so each panel can then span the number of columns required to create a row. So there we go, we've started and we've created our content. We've got the grid, the panel 1 spans 6 columns across, panel 2 spans 5 columns across, and we're starting to get the layout there. It's not much code for a lot of possibilities, but we probably aren't feeling like superheroes just yet. The layout of Action Comic number 1, like I said, doesn't play a huge role in the layout. It's being used as a container for artwork, and that's about it. So with a change in era to the Bronze Age, brought with it a change in how layout could become a part of the story. Spider-Man 121 there is released in 1973. It's considered a pivotal point in Spider-Man's sort of story. Now, I hope something from 1973 isn't going to be a spoiler, but this is the death of Gwen Stacy. So at the time, a death that was permanent, which in comics was an interesting thing. What's great about the story, along with that moment, the artwork and the characters, is the way the layout was an integral part of its telling. The height of the bridge and fall is shown beautifully through the spanning the panel. We wouldn't get that same effect if we had the same grid as before. So even though it's a great example of it, let's again split out the artwork. And this is the basics of our grid. The big difference is the large panels spanning multiple rows. And it's one of the areas where grid has given us a real sense of a modern layout in the web. No longer are we constrained to that single axis that we have been for so long. Determining the columns was done the same way that we did in the previous example, and turning this into code, we get the following. Setting up our grid, in this case we've had 23, and our little gap there. Adding in each of the panels, so panel 1, the sort of important one, our hero piece of this, it spans 9 columns across and then 3 rows down. Panel 2 is similar to the other ones, it spans 7. Panel 4, so it's kind of double the height of that. It spans across 8 columns, so we still get that staggering, and then spans 2 columns down. So now that we're working with multiple axes, we are able to cover a great many layouts up to the Bronze Age of comics. The next comic to look at is Watchmen. It's famous for many reasons, but one of them is it's considered to have kicked off the modern era of comics. It adhered to a really strict 9-panel layout in its run. And there's hundreds of possibilities of layout that you can do with 9 panels, which isn't a recommendation that we all go out and start using 9 panels like we've done sort of in the past. The joy of grid comes from how easy it is to define a grid and how many possibilities that opens up to us. But there's a particular panel from Watchman that did something outside the box with grid, a panel that I wanted to recreate. So the panel in the middle here, the artwork spans across multiple panels in the comic. Now we could split our artwork up into 3 images and just put them in there, but I think there's value in keeping that image intact while maintaining that. So if we keep it in one image, it'll give us flexibility, say if we need to swap the image out or if we start dealing with responsiveness later. So the grid I've sort of shown you already. This time we're adding in the rows. So our panel is wrapped in a container and that gets display contents. So what that does is essentially removes that container from there and makes panel 3 part of the grid. And you'll see why that's important in just a minute. And then panel 3, it spans between those columns. So we then add a pseudo element to the overlap. And what we do is we position that over the top of panel 3. So we've got the grid row and grid column. And then we set the outline to be the same size as the grid gap. So it now fills up that little spot in the middle without us having to have broken the image up into multiple pieces. So where I was mentioning the responsiveness, if we then wanted to resize down to say mobile, we could get rid of that gap and keep it just as the one image. Now, accessibility is always very important when playing around with new techniques. And there is an issue with display contents in some browsers. There's a bug in some of them which goes against the spec, that if display contents is applied to the element, a screen reader, for example, won't read those elements that are children of that. So our panel and our overlap will just basically not exist. So that's a problem that could mean you don't want to use this. There's a lot more detail at this article here if you want to look into that. With that said though, I had hoped to create this demo using subgrid. You may have been hearing a little bit about this. I think the change would be removing display contents and adding grid template column subgrid. And what that will mean is it will inherit the parent's grid items and lay it out. Now I say I think, which has probably really filled you all with a lot of confidence. None of the browsers actually have this out yet. I was reading examples and looking at the spec, but Firefox has been teasing the release and they're probably going to do it tomorrow after I've done this talk. But they've been teasing this release, so hopefully soon. But subgrid will mean that we can keep the semantics of our page while inheriting the grid from further up. Right, so it's the next evolution during the modern age of comics where layout gets really creative and interesting. Here we have layering panels to achieve a flow and a depth that we haven't previously seen. Up to now, we've relied on the implicit grid, but when you start layering items on top of each other, you'll need to define the columns and the rows so that you can position things effectively. You might be looking at those values and thinking, that looks like a lot. How did you come up with it? And it might seem a little intimidating. So here's the artwork. It's from Spider-Man 2018, very web-themed. One of the best ways to get started with that layout is determine the grid's dimension. So with the comic, I figured out how many rows were going to be in there and then the height of the comic. So dividing the height of the comic by the number of rows gives me essentially a base fraction. So if you've used grid, everything is in one fraction. Now, next, with a row, I'll divide that by the base fraction that we have. So 291, which is the height of our row, by 109, which is our base fraction, gives us 2.6 fractions. So why am I using fractions in these examples? It gives us the same ratios, it'll be consistent throughout, and it also means that we can do a lot more with the resizing and flowing of our comic. And then repeat that same process for the columns. So jumping back to our demo, with that panel 3, the grid row is 4 to 7, and then the grid columns 5, and you can span 1. The z-index brings it on top of everything else. Panel 4, we do the grid row 5 to 9, and something that I haven't shown yet is the grid column is 2 to -2. So what is happening with -2? It's a little bit of another handy way of laying out things in the grid. When you lay out a grid, the lines are numbered essentially 1 through to n, whatever that is. So in this case, 1 to 8. That's how many columns we had. Now, the browsers do that inverse as well. So you get -1 to -8. So when you're laying it out, we know that we want it to be 2 lines in from each side. So we have 2 from that side, and then we come in -2 from that side. The advantage of that, say, is if I add more lines in the middle, so say between 4 and 5 we add another few lines, we don't have to adjust the layout from the other one because we're coming in from the side. Again, it may look a little bit intimidating. Firefox Grid Inspector will show you these numbers for your grid, so it's a really handy tool when you're laying these out. So this can be a great way to finally break out of those boxy layouts that we've had for so long. The modern age of comics made prolific use of this layering. So here's another example from Hawkeye #1 and the recreated example on my left. So the borders there are what's creating the gaps in between that for us. It's an exciting addition to our toolbox, but we do have to consider more than the layouts that is open to us. There's an inherent danger when you can just place anything you want on the screen that the source order isn't also going to be maintained. So you can negatively impact, again, the accessibility of your project. So when laying out the project, if you decide that a panel, so in this case panel 4 was better suited positioned somewhere else, so we can move it from where it was to 1 span 5, we need to also update it in the source code because just by moving it visually, that doesn't tell the browser that it's moved in the source order. So a screen reader will still read these out in the previous layout that you had, even though we've moved it in front. So keep an eye on that. How can you avoid falling into that trap? Focus on the structure first. Build the HTML of your page. Then create the grid that supports that layout. And then, like any hero, be vigilant as things are added and changed on the design. A really good starting point to read about this is MDN's article, Accessibility, CSS Grid Layout and Accessibility article, which you can see at that link. But if you Google the grid layout and accessibility, you'll find your way there as well. They kind of run through that. So I said that it breaks out of the boxes, but a common criticism of web layout is that everything is within a box. Sometimes this has been referred to as bootstrap layouts, but there's a few names for them. These have been techniques that we've used for efficiency at the cost of creativity. As you can see there, everything is square. So for comics, boxy layouts started to change during the modern age of comics. Characters broke out of those boxes and storytelling once again evolved. Here's a nice example from Phoenix and Jean Grey #16. And then I've recreated it on the side. Now, fundamentally, everything is still in a box here. You can't get away with that from the grid, but with some clever techniques, we can make it look like we aren't in a box anymore. Now let's get the browser support part out of the way. Clip path is going to be your best friend here. I hope that wasn't a spoiler. So it's looking pretty good. Edge is actually swapping to Chromium, so that's going to change in there. So again, similar to our variable fonts, only really IE11, and that's not going to change, so you just adjust with that. Right, so how did I do this? The container, it's position relative. Later on, we're going to absolute position something. That's Y. Margin auto, that's just centering it. Our background image and some overflow hidden. Just sort of setting everything up for what we want to do. We add a new thing in there, panels, which is our grid. It's absolute position we do some left and right just to get it into spot, and display grid. Now the shape comes from rotating that into there. So we've got one column for each of the panels in our comic. Next up, we start laying our panels into this grid. So grid 1 fills up that space, number 2 fills up that, and it's clip path with the polygon that gives us those shapes in there. Now, it's funny, I was watching someone in the audience like twisting to try and sort of figure out what I was doing here. So let's look at the clip path without all the twisting and things like that, just to make it a little bit clearer. The clip path value is a polygon. Each of those sets, so 0 to 18, 20 to 20, they're just X and Y values. So the first one in the top of my right is 0 to 18, and then it starts going around the clip path like that. So that's how we get that shape of our little cat friend here. Now, if you're wondering how to calculate these values, if it still looks a little bit interesting, Firefox has us covered. So in the developer tools, you can click on this icon, and you can, in real time, start modifying the clip paths to really get it where you want it. Double clicking adds a new node, and then you can drag those. You will then take your code, copy it, and put it back into your CSS. Because it's going to be hard to sort of visualize that. This is a great option for that. So to achieve the border, I added the same clip path to the image itself, so it had the same clip path inside. And then I made the background white for that, and then scaled it down a little bit and changed the transform origin. Because the shapes aren't sort of round or symmetrical, you just need to sort of shimmy it into place. I didn't know I couldn't eyeball this. It was basically, you know, when you're in the dev tools and you just keep pressing up until it sort of shimmies there. I was like, I did it. I'm a web developer. So that's how that, but the downside here is you are going to have to be accurate with your gap. You can't rely on the grid to do the gap for you. The grid is giving us the ratio and the positioning, but if you're going to do something like this, you are going to have to be very accurate and use the gap yourself. So up and down in Firefox, and you'll get there. So there we go. We've essentially recreated a layout that you wouldn't often see on the web. It's something that's a little more unique and a little bit more exciting. You may notice that the CodePen links are underneath, so if you want to see any of the demos that I've been showing so far. But I'll also have one link at the end, which will be for the entire collection, so you can pick those up there. So it's no doubt a powerful tool when combined with Grid. This is another example, Detective Comics number 876 for the Batman fans out there. The drawing is a little more intense, but the effect is worth it. So taking the grid layering path from our examples earlier, we can recreate the same layout. I'm sorry for the Batman fans, but he's gone for now. Copyright's tricky. The shapes can be recreated by adding perspective and rotation. So panel 1 is up the top there. We give it some perspective and then rotate it using each of the axes to sort of get it into place. It gives us that unique shape to it. The same is sort of done with panel 2. You may be seeing a problem here with our layout though, isn't that they're showing the backs of the squares coming through. So clip path to the rescue. We can add that over the back and essentially cut out the shape from behind. It gives a really nice effect as if there's one whole border sort of surrounding our entire layout. Again, something that would have been quite tricky to do with the transparency and all of that before. So there we go. We've recreated Batman minus Batman. So it's not limited to just polygons like I've been showing though. This was another layout. This one was a lot of layering on top of each other and it was a bit of fun to create. But when you break it down, there's 3 types of clip paths. Polygon, which we've used before. Ellipses, ellipse. That, the values there, how do you pronounce ellipse? I should have checked that before putting a slide with it on there. Ellipse. The first values are the, what am I trying to say, the radius. So the first two values are each of the radius. And then the second two are the offset. So you can offset it in your shape depending on where you want that to be. It doesn't just have to be in the center. Circle, we again have much easier to pronounce. And then we get the radius on there, just a single one because it's a uniform shape. And then again, we can offset that with the X and Y values. So clip path affected the shape of the container, but we may also want our text to react to the shape of the container. So that's where the shape outside is going to come into play. Same too again, but keeping in mind that Microsoft is moving to Chromium with Edge. So this, again, won't be a problem for very long. So looking at this panel from Saga, the text wraps around the planet quite nicely. This is an effect that you probably have seen in a lot of magazines before. It's a little more common in that area, but we haven't really been able to do it up until this point. We have our panel from before, so everything's still sitting in a grid. This one's got 3 rows. The paragraph tag, is sitting in the panel, is just sort of moved into place about where we want it. And then the image, we float it, we give it some dimension, but then the shape outside is the part that is interesting. We give it the circle like we've seen before, the radius, and then the text starts to wrap around that shape. Again, Firefox has really been helping us developers out in this area. Clicking on that same icon, we can again in real time start to play around with the shape and really get it to exactly where you want it. I'm really loving seeing what Firefox in particular have been doing with these dev tools, and I think other browsers will start to follow suit. And again, it's not limited to just circles and ellipses. We can do the polygon, and with our cat here, deep in thought, but if he'd known, then we can start to draw around the shape of the cat. Can make really interesting, complex shapes. This is not the final form of our comic though. What we have created is a great example of the modern web, but it is based on Western comics, structures and styles. That's reading left to right, top to bottom. For instance, that structure and reading style isn't the only comic structure that's available though. For instance, Japan has a very healthy manga industry. I've been a particular fan of Naruto for a while, so it's serendipitous that I'm able to actually bring it up in a talk, just almost for no reason. But the same page here is in the Japanese and the English version. Now, even in the English translation, it reads from right to left, top to bottom. So essentially the opposite of what we've been doing. Now, we could position the cells in the order that they appear in the comic, but again, if we remember, if we do that, the source order is going to be wrong. So how do we sort of handle this? This is one of those really great areas of Grid, and probably something that I suspect Jason will be talking about in just a second, stealing your thunder. Grid on my left, no, on my right, it's opposite on here. It's very confusing. So on my right is the sort of traditional version, left to right. We see the panels 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in the order that we do. All we have to do in this case is add direction right to left, and everything flips for us. So comics, Grid takes care of it for us. So it's a great addition to that. Of interest in the Naruto comic is you may have noticed that the gaps are a little bit all over the place. They're not uniform and unique. And this is actually something that Grid also supports. We got the grid gap there with 2 rem for the gaps between the rows, and then 1 rem for the gaps between the columns. So you can even get a little bit creative in that area as well. What's also worth noting in the manga version is that the text runs vertically, but in English, it's left to right. So the language is right to left, and then vertical top to bottom. And then we read as we normally do. I am not going to attempt to write Japanese because I would be scared at what that would actually say. So instead, I'm taking the English version. And again, this is a really nice CSS property. We get the writing mode. We can just say vertical, right to left. Now, if you have a logographic character set, so in this case, the Japanese character set, it will actually stack correctly. I don't know why English turns that way. It does. So we've arrived in the modern age of web layout with grid, clip path, CSS shapes, and writing mode. CSS Grid Spec Level 2 is hopefully coming soon and bringing with it subgrid. It's going to allow us the ability to align children elements within the parent grid. And Firefox development version will hopefully have that out soon so you can test and play. There are subgrid examples on Rachel Andrews' Grid by Example, so they're really good to have a look at. There's work being done on clip path to support SVG paths, which would make something like this a little more feasible. We still are limited to polygons, which are straight, right? We can't do curves in those, so you can't combine the polygon and the ellipse. So if we wanted something like the bottom here, if we do get that support, that's going to open us up to a whole new range of layout techniques. So I hope the examples have given you ideas of how you can start breaking outside the box when it comes to layout. The next time your designer creates a design that maybe was freaking you out before, you'll feel a little more heroic in tackling it now. These examples, like I said, were for comics, but they can be applied to portfolios, ads, products pages, blog articles, really anything. And I hope that they've given you ideas for the projects that you're currently working on now and how you could make them a little more exciting. And I think it's, as Mandy said, echoing her same sentiment, it's time to start getting creative in the modern age of web. We can do so much with the tech stuff that she had, and then we can complement that with the layout as well. Remember, with great power comes great responsibility. Not sure who said it. It's somewhat meant to be famous. Always factor in accessibility, usability, internationalization, and your users' needs when working with these techniques. It'll be great if you create a layout that's amazing and technically impressive, but if it doesn't meet the needs of your users, then they have probably been misused and you are now the bad guy. You're not really. You're good people. Because you wouldn't do that because you'll remember this slide. And you'll be like, I think Anton said it. So the code examples for this can be found on this CodePen collection. That has all of them. Feel free to have a play around and show me what you can do. It'll be exciting to see what others create with this work. Waiting for everyone to take photos. I'll also tweet that out. So I'm going to borrow a phrase here from someone who's done so much for the comic industry and passed away recently. And I actually looked up what this meant. And according to the internet, it means ever upward. And I think that's a nice finishing point for this talk. With layout, with everything that you can do, ever upwards, and you'll keep improving it. So thanks very much